Hey, welcome back to Chocolate City Tech. If this is your first time, welcome. I'm Derek. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to continue our lessons with the car rental, the exotic car rental that we started. So this episode is all dedicated to setting up the environment. And at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to set up, well, not just the environment, but I'm also going to go over how we're going to be using Docker locally, specifically for our for the database, um, for Postgres database. So these are some of the items that I want to get installed. So if you don't have these, let's get going. If you already have these, then you can almost sort of fast forward on this portion. So first we're going to need Visual Studio. Now you don't have to install Visual Studio. You can actually just use VS Code, Visual Studio Code, which is going to be just fine. Next thing you want to get is you want to get VS Code. So go ahead, do the same thing. Download VS Code for Mac, Windows, Linux, and you should be good to go with that. Next item you want to get is you want to get Docker, right? So as I mentioned in the last episode, and if you I didn't see the last episode, I'm going to put a link in the description there. But essentially, what we're doing is we're creating a car rental application, and our backend is going to be the backend API is going to be all C#.NET API, web API. So I wanted to use Docker specifically for our Postgres database. So what we're going to have here is it's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to set up Docker Compose file, and that's something that we're going to cover at the end of the video. I shouldn't say the end, but towards the end of the video, that's all going to be dedicated to Docker. So go ahead and get Docker installed. Next thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and get .NET 5, which is the latest and greatest. The next piece of item you want to do is you want to go ahead and get Node.js installed. In this episode, we probably won't do anything with Node.js, but you might as well go ahead and get that installed. And last but not least, we're going to be installing. So you don't have to install the Zapper yet. If you are familiar with Nest.js, it's very similar. So that's what we're going to be working with. I've never done Svelte, but I'm going to jump right in. And of course, I could have jumped right into Svelte, but I'm going to jump into Zapper instead. So that should be a lot of fun. All right. So I'm not going to be using Visual Studio VS Code for this portion. I just want to pull it up because essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to check that all the items that we installed are working. And then also I'm going to follow up with what I mentioned before, which is going to be working on the Docker Compose piece. All right. So first thing I want to do is just check on a few items. So I'm going to bring up the terminal for VS Code. And I want to check on a few items, right? So first, we want to make sure that all the items that we installed are actually here. All right, so I feel somewhat obligated to go over Docker just a little bit before we sort of proceed ahead. So if you already know Docker, you can sort of fast forward on this one. But if you don't, I'll just give a brief overview. So Docker essentially is a containerization sort of system, and it's really powerful for working not just locally but also in production as well. Essentially, what it does is it tries to give you this guarantee that if it works locally, it's going to work anywhere else because you run it on the same OS. You run it on, all your environment is essentially going to be it's basically the same, right? When people typically explain what it is, I think the best explanation is something along the lines of Docker is sort of like a virtual machine, right? Because, but unlike a virtual machine, it doesn't have its own operating system. So what it does is it runs on the host operating system. So it makes it a little bit smaller, a lot more lightweight, and a lot faster. Now, what I have here is a few Docker services that we're going to be using. And I guess what I can do is just do a quick Docker. If you've never played with Docker before, running Docker run will typically run your whatever image you have installed, and it'll run that image as a container. So if you ever heard the words, the container and image, it's what that really is your image is sort of like a blueprint, right? Sort of like a class, and the container is the running image. So the instance of the um the image. So when I issue Docker run, and before I even go forward, one of the things I always like to mention is that you never really have to know everything from day one. As you can see here, whatever it is that you don't understand, when you type it in, type in help, typically you're going to get enough information to sort of get you going. If all else fails, you can obviously always just Google it, right? So with that said, like most things in tech, you can run a Hello World application. So there should be a Hello World version here. Also, it only runs if you actually type it correctly. And all it does is just spits out a message saying hello world, and a few instructions, and also tells you that if you want to do something a bit more fun, run this Ubuntu image. Now, when you call Docker run, if the image is already on your machine, then it's just going to go ahead and run it. But if it doesn't, then it's going to reach out to the registry and then run it, pull it down to your machine, and then run it from there. Right. And as you can see, because I didn't tell specifically which one I want, it always goes and pulls the whatever's tagged as being the latest. So, and we can exit out of this. Actually, I believe it's just exit. There you go. So we exit out of that. So that was an actual Ubuntu running. If you don't believe it, you can actually go back in there and you can see that that was an actual Ubuntu machine running. So, and because we gave the -it, that means you want to run it interactively. All right. So with that said, that's basically Docker in a nutshell, right? Pretty. I don't want to say it's simple because it isn't. But once you start playing around with it, it gets a lot easier. So go ahead and play around with it some more if it's your first time. There's just so much you can learn from it, but don't get lost. So anyway, back to our what we actually want to do here. So we want to run this pgadmin compose file, and what that really does is it's going to create two services for us. This first service is Docker, is this Postgres database, and the other service is a Postgres admin interface, similar to if you ever work with phpMyAdmin. This is basically exactly the same thing. So what is this service thing, right? So service is, before we even get there, what is a version? So Docker Compose, much like just about anything else, has different formats and different versions of itself. It is currently in, shouldn't say currently, but the last one that I used was from version 3.1. I haven't checked on if there's a newer version than 3.1, but 3.1 is the version that I'm working on. Services are one or more items that you want Docker to either build for you, run for you, and sort of put together for you. And yeah, in our case, we want to run several services. The services all have names, and we're choosing to call this Postgres DB because it's a Postgres DB, right? And oh, yeah, that might be a little too much. The image that we're going to run now, this is similar to what we just did when we call Docker run hello, right? All of this, we wanted this image, it pulled down the image, built it, and ran it. These are all images that I do have locally: Ubuntu, Postgres, MySQL, and so on and so forth. So like I said, I usually have a few instances of these run for various projects. So that's what that is, right? So these are images, and you don't always have to just pass an image. You can actually pass it a build command or a build directive here. And what that would do is you can give it a location, a file path to where your Docker file is, and it will go ahead and build that. Restart is pretty much what it sounds like. It means that if this machine should fail, we want Docker compose to make sure that another one restarts. Here we are locating a certain amount of memory for it, a certain amount of space for it. You can pass environmental. You can pass environment variables, And this can also point to a file. It doesn't have to be put here, which can make it really easy when you're doing deployments. So you can deploy this and then your secret files can be elsewhere. Some of the environments that you can pass specifically to this particular image, and you can look it up when you go to look for a Postgres image. They will explain to you some of the environment variables that you can pass in. In this case, one of them is Postgres user ID or user, and then the password. And then you can assign a port that you want it to run on. Now, because of the way that Docker works, these images or these containers, when they are running in their own little bubble, right? So in order for your host machine to be able to contact it, you want to expose a port that connects your host machine to the Docker instance. So the Docker container is running. So what we're doing here is we're selling that for the Docker instance, the port that is running, which is 5432, we want to link that essentially over to our host machine, which is 5555. Right. The other thing that you can do is, so that's what you can do with ports. Networks. Once again, Docker instances run in a bubble. They are isolated from each other. So when one dies, the other just say, "Oh, okay, you died." Well, actually, that's the same because they won't know about it, right? So to sort of cure that, what you do here is we can link them together. And one of the ways to do that is by giving it a network so that it can all operate on the same network. So in this scenario here, we are simply given a PG admin local. And in fact, what we can actually do is we can inspect the network to see what's there, but we're not running this yet. So when we run it, I'll show you that part. What else here? Volumes. So volumes are how you essentially save data from this little bubble that is called Docker instance, right? This Docker container. Docker is essentially, it's not essentially, it is ephemeral, meaning it doesn't persist, right? It's kind of weird because it's database, so it is going to persist. But it doesn't, it basically, data doesn't stick around. So if the machine itself, the Docker instance, crashes, your data is gone. So what you want to do in that scenario is you want to map it to someplace on the host machine. In this case, we're going to map it over to this location. And then you just declare this, and then you add it to the volumes, the outer section of the volume. PG admin, this is just another image, but this is the web UI that is going to be used to manage Postgres. And the image is from dpage PG admin 4. Same variable, always restart always, memory limit, same here. The gig limit, and of course the environment variable is also same thing here, right? So give it a default email, password, and once again, you can always go and look at the image and you get the description of all the environment variables that you can actually pass to it. Same thing with the port, right? So on the host machine, it's going to run on HTTP 80, and then we want to map it over to localhost 777. So when we go ahead and run this, we're going to have to go to localhost port 7777, right? And same thing, right? We want these two bubbles who are living in their own bubbles to be able to talk to each other, right? So we create a network and network name, and here we use what is called a bridge to communicate. All right, so how do you run this whole thing? You send a command for Docker compose, and you pass it, and Docker compose up, and you're good to go. Now, the assumption here is that there's a docker compose.yaml file. As you can see here, that's not what we have, right? We have pgadmin compose.yaml. So in order to tell Docker that, what we do is we pass F and we say, this is the file name, this is our file path. And again, always spell it right. And we don't want to run this interactively. So what we're going to do is we're going to run it in detached mode. So Docker compose. Now, because I already had this running, all of that did was just really nothing. So as you can see, my instance are running. If my instance running, you will see a whole bunch of messages getting it started, pulling down the images and all that stuff. So one of the other things that I want to point out here is that if you are here in Visual Studio Code, if you could have been doing this command line, you didn't have to do this here. If you're on VS Code, VS Code has an incredible support for Docker. So what you can actually do is you can actually run these instances from here. Now, the other thing that you can actually do is you can also pull in a Docker desktop, which for you, if you are on Windows or Mac, you're gonna have this. I don't believe this is available on Linux, but like I said, you can just literally run this here as well. And because we have Visual Studio installed, we can actually get VS Code installed. We can do, you can run it from you. You don't have to come here. You can obviously come here, take a look at it. From here, you can, open a command line to your instance that's running, or you can open it in the browser, which is what we want to do in this scenario because this is a browser application. And here it is, right? So if you recall, what we have to do is go back and get our credentials. And there you go. So here it is. We have an admin area. So what we want to do is, before we go any further, we want to go ahead and create a server for ourselves. So create server, exotic rental, exotic rental server, connection. So for connection, we're going to go back to our Postgres ID here. Put that down. That's the name of it. Remember the port that we said we wanted to listen to on this? All right. That's the port that is running on. Their username is not local DB user. And our password is, let's go back, grab that. Oh, okay. Very secretive, of course. Save our password. And we don't have to do anything regarding this pieces here. Let's save that. And there we go. We now have an exotic rental server. Databases, obviously there's always a default database for Postgres. That's the local DB user database that was created for us. And I don't know if you actually want to use this one. Let's create another database actually. And save. And that's really it. There's really nothing else we need to do for now. We now have our database created. So let's do a quick recap. So we installed for our database, for our environment, we installed Visual Studio Code, we installed Visual Studio, we installed Docker, we installed Node.js. We haven't installed Zapper yet because we don't need to yet. And we're essentially ready to go. We are almost ready to go. I'll see you in the next one. As usual, if you like this kind of content, subscribe, like, and share. Help the channel grow. If you have any questions, just drop me a note in there. You can follow me on Twitter or any of those social media places that people go these days. All right, in the description. All right, peace.